Welcome back to a new series. So we are kicking off our series for the T-SQL language, T-SQL being Transact SQL, which is used in the Microsoft SQL Server database. So again, this is kind of kicking off our new series. And to kick off this series, we're going to kind of start definitely with what I would call as a more advanced topic, but it was a highly requested topic to cover, which is how do we work with Excel files using T-SQL? So when I say working with, what do I mean? Well, I mean importing and exporting data to an Excel file, all from your SQL Server query. And so basically this little window right here. So just as a little bit of a caveat though, it's deceiving. This process looks like it's going to be really easy, at least from the documentation you see online. But the documentation is assuming that you've turned on a lot of functionality that by default is not turned on. So that's kind of like the confusing part. They make it look easy and they have all these like caveats in there. But the biggest thing is there's so many features that you have to turn on in order for this to work. And more importantly, you have to know a lot about your system in general, that depending on what version of the system you're on, you could actually have different steps than somebody on a different version of this system. So I've done my best to kind of document as much as possible regarding this topic. I can't promise you it's everything, but I will say it's pretty cohesive. I think there's pretty much anything you need here. You probably can find in all this documentation that I've written. But that's just kind of the warning as we're going to go into this process is it's deceiving. It looks simple. There's actually a lot that has to be done beforehand. And this also would be assuming that you have administrator rights to your database. So if you don't have that, then you would have to be able to basically work with somebody and say, hey, I need to turn this feature on and this feature on in order to do this particular type of query that I'm trying to do. So that's just kind of throwing that out there before we begin. So to give you some context as to what we're going to be doing, so I'm currently on my desktop. I have two files. One is called sales data, which contains data that I want to import from Excel into SQL Server. And then there's another one where we're going to be exporting to. And then on this particular workbook, there's 4 sheets, data A, B, and C, and D. One is just a simple range. Another one is going to be demonstrating how we select all the data from a different sheet. This one would be demonstrating how we select data from a named range. So this is actually a named range. And then finally, I'm going to kind of talk to you about tables a little bit. Tables are deceiving. You would think that you would just run it a certain way, but if you do it what you would think is the normal way of doing it, you actually get an error. And we're going to have to talk about tables because technically you can import them, but it's assuming you have certain information beforehand, which I'm going to doubt most of you probably would, because I wouldn't most of the time have it. So that's the import workbook. We also have an export workbook that is just one sheet. It's called data. And in this worksheet, there's just 3 column headers: country, product, and sales. So this is the workbook that we're going to be exporting to. Okay, so with that being said, now we're going to go into the fun part. Which is getting things set up. And this is also the kind of confusing part. So there's a couple things you need to know about your system. The first one is you need to determine whether you're running 32-bit SQL Server or 64-bit SQL Server. And depending on that, that will kind of lead you into your next question, which is which driver do I need in order to access the particular Excel file that I'm working with? So we're going to kind of work this from a couple different ways. The first one is, well, what if I want to work with an Excel 2003 file? What if I want to work with an Excel 2007 file? And then what if I want to work with an Excel file that's later than 2007? How would I do that? Well, again, kind of starting things off, depends the version. Let's say you wanted to work with a 2003 file. In that particular case, you would be working with the Microsoft Jet OLEDB 4.0 driver. So this particular driver is used with 2003 files if you're on 32-bit SQL Server. If you're on 32-bit SQL Server, you can also use the Microsoft ace.oledb driver. But in that particular situation, you would be using that driver for 2007 files. So let's recap. If you're on 32-bit SQL Server, you can work with two types of files, Excel 2003 and Excel 2007. If you want to work with Excel 2003, you're going to use Microsoft.jet. If you're going to work with Excel 2007 files, you're going to work with Microsoft.ace. So that's working with 2007, 2003, 32-bit version SQL. If you are on 64-bit SQL Server, guess what? That's probably the simplest one out of all of them. I hope to God most of you are on that. In that particular instance, you would be using the Microsoft ACE OLEDB driver. So yes, you can use this particular driver with 32-bit, but if you're on 64-bit, you would really only be using this one. You wouldn't be using Microsoft.jet. And if you're using the 64-bit SQL Server, guess what? It's really, really simple. You can work with any of the Excel files. So if you're on 64-bit SQL Server and you have the Microsoft ACE OLEDB driver, you can work with any of the Excel files. So the first thing that you have to do is you have to make sure you have the driver that you need. I've put a link here that will take you to the driver's download page. Download the correct one depending on the version of SQL that you're on, and so on and so on, and then also with the Excel file that you're planning to work with. From here, then there's step 2. So this would be your step 1, getting the driver, you're good to go. The second one is configuring some settings on your system. So this is where if you don't have access, you would have to have someone who has administrator right access to your database. Now, with that, in this particular situation, we're going to turn on something called ad hoc distributed queries. To do this, you have to do technically 2 steps. The first one is you have to turn on the advanced options setting. Anytime we're doing anything like this where we're kind of changing system settings or things like that, we're going to be using something called a stored procedure. A stored procedure is just a collection of SQL code or whatever you want to call it, and all it's going to be doing is kind of just running that code. You pass through some parameters, and those parameters are going to be what the setting, how you're going to be changing the setting. So why do we even need to turn this on by default? Well, by default, when you install your server, these settings are not made available to you. So they're kind of turned off in a sense. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be turning on these show advanced options because that's going to allow you to change other settings in your system. So all that you have to do is you have to execute the sp configure procedure, so the stored procedure configure. You have to specify what you're going to execute with it. In this case, we want to turn on show advanced options, and we're denoting turned on by passing through a 1. By default, show advanced options is set to 0. We want to turn it on to 1. And so really, all you're doing is you would just run this particular line of code. So it would just run it, and then now it tells you down here, hey, change from 1 to 1. So I already had mine turned on, but this is the message it would display to you. Once you've turned it on, you can go on to basically the next step, which is turning on ad hoc distributed queries. By turning this on, you're going to get access to the Openrowset and Open Data Source functionality that's built in to T-SQL. And by doing this, we can now import and export directly to Excel documents, Access database, and a whole bunch of other data sources. So this is kind of giving you access to import and export data between different OLEDB providers. And all you have to do here is, again, you're going to call the stored procedure configure. You're going to specify ad hoc distributed queries in this example, and you're going to turn it on by specifying 1. Again, by default, it's set to 0. And so if you ran this, you would see that mine changes from 1 to 1. It's already was turned on because I've done this before. So this is allowing you to use OLEDB DB providers from SQL Server. Very important that we do this. Once you've done that, step 3. Again, it's also going to depend a little bit as to what type of Excel file you're working with. In this case, if you're on 32-bit version, if you're on the 32-bit version of Excel, not Excel, if you're on the 32-bit version of SQL Server, you have to do this step. If you're on 64-bit, you do not have to do this step. Again, to reiterate, if you're on 64-bit SQL Server, you do not have to do this step. If you're on 32-bit SQL Server, you have to do this step. This step involves granting rights to the temporary directory that SQL Server uses. Now, I've put a lot of different errors that you might encounter, the description of the error, and the response that you're probably going to get. In this particular example, this one will be the OLEDB provider Microsoft.jet.oledb.4.0 for link server return message unspecified error. Again, I make a note, it only applies to 32-bit SQL Server. Basically what's happening is the OLEDB provider is trying to create a temporary file during the query in the SQL Server temp directory using credentials of the user who ran the query. So if I'm running the query, it's going to use my credentials. If the SQL user doesn't have access to the temp folder, then SQL can't create the temporary folder. Perform the following steps to fix this issue. The first thing is you're going to go to your temporary folder. Well, depending on how you're running SQL Server, your temporary folder is going to look a little bit different. If SQL Server is run under network service account, then this would be where it's located. If you're running under a local service account, this is how it would look. The only difference is this one's network service, this one's local service. Once you've gotten that file path, then you need to grant read-write access to the temp folder for the specified user. This can be done using iCals. Or I think that's what it is. I think I misspelled that. And with iCals, what you can do is you can specify the directory. You're going to grant a user read-write access. And this can be run from PowerShell. Again, you're probably going to have to work with your database administrator in order to do this. So after you've granted the temporary directory access, you can move on to the next step. Again, this would only be if you're on 32-bit SQL Server. So the final step is you want to configure ACE OLEDB properties. And so in this particular situation, this would only be if you're actually using the Microsoft.ace driver. So if you were using Jet, you wouldn't be doing this step. And what is the step that we have to configure? Well, it's a couple different things. It's going to be kind of a little bit like the show advanced options, but in this particular step, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be first using the stored procedure Microsoft set OLED property for short. You specify the OLEDB provider that you want to configure, and then you specify the setting that you want to configure, and then you specify whether you want to turn it on or off. In both instances, you're going to be turning this feature on. The first feature that you're going to be turning on is the allow in process. So by selecting allow in process, SQL Server allows the provider to be instantiated or allows the provider to run as an in-process server. When the option is not set, the default behavior is to allow the provider to run outside the SQL Server process. We just want this feature to be turned on. That's all. The second option that we can turn on is the dynamic parameters feature. And by turning this one on, we allow SQL placeholders represented by the little question marks in parameterized queries. That's all. So this is just setting the properties of your OLEDB provider. That's all. And again, you would only do this step if you're planning to use the Microsoft.ace.oledb provider. Cool. So at that point, you're pretty much good to go. You are actually done. You've set up everything. You can begin to actually start using the Openrowset functionality from SQL Server. Again, I have provided common errors that you might run into as you're using this functionality, but again, I try to make it as simple as possible and give you guys steps as to how you would fix it. This is kind of, again, like I said, this whole thing is deceiving. It looks simple, but it's assuming that you've already turned on and set up things in a very particular way. Okay, so how do we actually do this? It's pretty straightforward for the most part. In fact, I'm not going to really be writing any code. I'm kind of just going to be showing you the code I've already written and explain kind of what's going on and showing you what it looks like when we use it. So the first thing we want to do is maybe we just want to select all the data from an Excel workbook. Well, how do we do that? We still are going to be using our traditional select statement. In this case, I'm going to use the asterisk symbol to denote that I want to select all columns. And then I got to specify where I'm selecting it from. In this case, I'm selecting from an Openrowset function. With the Openrowset function, there's a couple parameters that you need to pass through. The first one is the provider that you're going to be using. In this case, I'm going to be using the Microsoft.ace driver. And then I need to pass through the connection string for that particular provider. So depending on the provider that you're using, it could look very different. In my case, I'm going to be using Excel 12.0 because I'm on the latest version of Excel. And then I need to specify the database. The database is simply the file path to the Excel file that I want to import the data from. A couple things you want to note is I am separating kind of each parameter by a semicolon. And then once I've done that, so once I've kind of defined my connection string, I need to specify where I need to import my data from. When we're using an OLED provider, the syntax can change a little bit. But for Microsoft ACE, it's really simple. We specify the sheet name and then a $sign. All this is saying is select the entire range that's being used on sheet data A. And so if I was to run this one, it would look exactly like that. So this imported the data from sheet data A and it selected the entire used range. Now, in some cases, you might want to select the entire, or you might want to select a subset of the range. In that particular situation, everything's going to be exactly the same. You would still specify your sheet. In this case, I'm just selecting from a different sheet, but you're going to specify the range that you want to select from. You're going to specify the range. So in this case, I'm selecting A1 to C2. So just the first two rows. And in this case, it's just one row of actual data because my first row was the headers. Now, what you can also do is, oh, the fun one. So now we're going to talk about tables. It's deceiving. You would think that if I wanted to select a table in other queries that we've done with OLED providers, you simply specify the table name. Well, if you were to do that, guess what? Oh, it says that it doesn't exist. Well, then of course I tried. I said, well, maybe it just needs the $sign at the end, right? Nope, still nothing. In fact, there's no way to do it. I could select from the sheet, and I know my table exists on, on the worksheet data C, but there's no way to actually reference a table or list object from the using an OLED provider in SQL Server. So that's unfortunately one of the drawbacks. What you would have to do is you would have to know the range of that table. So in other words, I would have to go to data C sheet and I would have to see what range that list object takes up. If I don't have that information, unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to select that individual table as a whole. I could select from the sheet, but then there might be a situation where it selects everything from the sheet because it might be a range that spans, multiple columns and includes, not connected ranges. So that is unfortunately one of the drawbacks is we can't import directly from a table. Now, you can import from named ranges though. And this was also a little bit deceiving because technically when you're creating a table, it does create a named range. But for whatever reason, that particular named range is not seen by SQL, but a name range that you manually define would be seen. So what I've done is I've defined a named range on the worksheet data D, and I called that name range country data. And what I do here is I select that name range, and that's all that's doing. With name ranges, you can also surround it in brackets like you did up here, or you could just leave it on its own. It's really up to you how you want to approach it. But keep in mind, you can actually select name ranges. But unfortunately, the named range that is defined for a table would not be seen by SQL Server for some very particular reason, I'm sure. Additionally, if you wanted to, you can actually pass through a query inside your statement as well. So if I wanted to, instead of doing this, what I could say is, hey, I want to select star from country data. And here, I'm not specifying a sheet, I'm not specifying a named range, I'm actually specifying a query inside my particular Excel workbook. So maybe I want to select, I don't know, from data A, where sales is greater than 20,000 or something like that. I don't know, something like that. You have a query that specifies some conditions. So you can do that using the query as well. It's up to you kind of how you want to approach that particular problem. But do know you can pass through a query that maybe specifies a very specific portion of that range. You don't have to necessarily select the entire range by default. So that's selecting a range from an Excel workbook. What if we wanted to insert this data directly into a table? Well, that's actually really easy to do as well. What we can do is we can select into a table. It looks exactly the same, but really all that's changed is we're selecting all the columns and we're going to insert into a table called My Data. Now, this is actually going to create a temporary table. By default, I've set it up in a very particular way that's going to create a temporary table, but you could also insert into a table that is permanent. So it's up to you, but in my example, I'm just using a temporary table. It's still going to look exactly the same. If it was a permanent table, you would just specify the permanent one. And so what it's going to do here, I wonder if I dropped the, yeah, okay, sorry. I didn't drop the other one. And so to drop a table, in case you were curious, you just do drop table my data. And so from here, because I already had a table, it's actually, you wouldn't do an insert, you would have to do an update at that point. So this one, it's selecting into a table. And here, I'm selecting the data that was just inserted. So now I have a table that's actually in my Sigma coding database that contains the data I just inserted. So that's definitely kind of neat. I thought that was neat. It does make sometimes where you're working with external data sources, so maybe you're working with somebody on your team who does a lot of calculations in Excel and they want that data to be reflected in the SQL database. This is kind of how you would do that if you wanted to do something like that. We can also export data to an Excel file. It's almost identical to the to almost like importing, but what we're going to do now is we're going to do insert into. So insert into this particular data source, the values that I get from my query that I did up here. So insert into this table in a sense. This is kind of like your table. Your table is data. In this particular example, I'm saying, hey, select into data, the data that I get from this query, or the values that I get from this query. So if I run this one, it would do that. And then also, what you could do as well is you don't have to do it in a query per se, I don't believe. You could just also specify the sheet. Again, it really depends what you're trying to do, but just know you can do both options if you wanted to. More than likely, if you're just going directly into a sheet, it's probably better to do it like that, unless you want to do something where you wanted to insert it or something along that nature, then you might have to do something a little bit different. Okay, so what this did is it exported my data into that Excel workbook. Let's see if it's there. So it should be here, and I should see some data. So it did that, and it looks like for whatever reason, it inserted it below. There's a good chance that when I had done it before, unfortunately, I've run this before, so it might remember the range that I inserted beforehand. So it's basically thinking that I've already inserted data, but the reality is I actually haven't. I deleted that old data, but it's just remembering where it left off on the last time. I'm sure if I was to close the connection or something like that, then it would probably kind of just reset everything and it wouldn't remember where we had picked up off the last time. But that does show you can export directly into an Excel workbook if you wanted to. There might be some formatting issues, unfortunately, just because if you store it as a string like I was kind of doing, I kind of just went with default, and usually by default it just kind of puts it as a string. You might have to do some formatting, but again, if you had formatted your table in a very particular way in SQL, you probably wouldn't be running into that issue. So yeah. All right, so that does it for this particular tutorial. Sorry there was a lot, but I wanted to kind of be thorough in making sure that people understood how to get set up. I didn't want to kind of just jump right into it because I'm pretty sure like 95% of you probably would have encountered errors. And so I thought it was worth it to go through some of the details beforehand. But this is really how you would work with Excel files using SQL Server. Now, obviously, there's more that you can do with this. Maybe you want to do update values or things along that nature. It's pretty much always the same. You just have to remember at this point, you're selecting from a data source, and that when you're selecting from that data source, it's just going to return a table in a sense. So you just have to treat it as a table. And so if you're trying to update update values in one table from another table, ask yourself, how would I do that traditionally? You're just going to apply that same logic to the Openrowset aspect as well. So at this point, if you have any questions as to how to work with these data sources or how to import or export data from an Excel file, please put them down in the comments below and I will try to help you through it. I'll also put some links to some documentations that will help with connection strings or things along that nature. If anyone figures out how to select from a table, please let me know. I'd be so curious. And what I'm saying is select in like a traditional sense, like table one, because that would be very helpful if someone could do that. But yeah, so that's pretty much the whole topic in a nutshell. Also, if you could, please make sure to like the video. We always appreciate the support. And if you're not already, please make sure to subscribe to the channel so that way you stay up to date with all the topics that I'm going to start to release. So thank you again for watching, everybody. We will see you in the next video.